Welcome to the Crossroads of History. Located in Richmond's historic Shockoe Slip, the Valentine First Freedom Center is situated on the same corner where Virginia's General Assembly met in secret during the American Revolution, and where the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom was signed. Free to visit and explore, the First Freedom Center celebrates this important history by exploring the past, present, and future of religious freedom in America. Thomas Jefferson drafted the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom in 1777. He believed that in order to develop a strong, independent country, Americans must first develop strong, independent minds. In the opening line, Jefferson wrote that Almighty God hath created the mind free. Jefferson asserted that no individual should be compelled to attend or support a religious institution, nor should they be penalized for their religious beliefs or lack thereof. Introduced to the General Assembly by friend and supporter James Madison, the legislative body passed the statute in 1786. Jefferson's statute paved the way for the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and continues to impact how Virginians and the nation view the free exercise of religion. Here at the Valentine First Freedom Center, you can experience this history through our interactive exhibit, reflection space, and the beautiful First Freedom Monument, located right outside. We look forward to sharing these unique and important Richmond stories with you.
Good morning. My name is Liz Riley Brown, and I am the Education and Engagement Director here at the Valentine. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Valentine First Freedom Center's 4th annual celebration of Religious Freedom Day. We are so glad that you could join us this morning. And we will begin this morning with a reading from the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, led by Cantor Sarah Beck-Berman. Cantor Beck-Berman earned her BA in Religious Studies from VCU and was ordained a cantor in 2018 by the ALEPH Alliance for Jewish Renewal Cantorial Program. She is the cantor at Congregation Beth Ahabah, where she leads the congregation in singing during services, chants from sacred scriptures, interprets them, and works with the adult and youth choirs, and enjoys teaching people of all ages. She is also the B'nai Mitzvah coordinator at Beth Ahabah, supervising tutors, working with students and families to plan meaningful and fun milestones. Thank you for being here, Cantor Beck-Berman.
Thank you so much. As Jewish clergy, and even as simply a Jewish person growing up in America, I have long had an appreciation for our continued efforts to maintain a pluralistic society. I'm grateful for all the opportunities that I've had as an American, free to be Jewish and practice Judaism in relative safety. I say relative safety because, of course, the events of last Saturday and other examples in recent memory prove that it takes continual effort to maintain a pluralistic society. As a famous Talmudic rabbi once taught, it is not upon you to complete the work, but neither are you free to desist from it. As we acknowledge the work that we have done and must continue to do as a nation, it's now my honor to read excerpts from a document that started us down the path to freedom of religion, Jefferson's Act for Establishing Religious Freedom. Whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free, that all attempts to influence it by temporal punishments or burthens, or by civil incapacitations, tend only to beget habits of hypocrisy and meanness, and therefore are a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion, that to compel a man to furnish contributions of money, for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves is sinful and tyrannical, that our civil rights have no dependence on our religious opinions any more than our opinions in physics or geometry. And finally, that truth is great and will prevail if left to herself, that she is the proper and sufficient antagonist to error and has nothing to fear from the conflict unless by human interposition disarmed of her natural weapons, free argument and debate. Be it enacted by the General Assembly that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burthened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, but that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. We are free to declare and do declare that the rights hereby asserted are of the natural rights of mankind, and that if any act shall be hereafter passed to repeal the present or to narrow its operation, such act will be an infringement of natural right.
Welcome. It's Bill Martin, the director here at the Valentine, and we are glad that you've chosen to join us this morning for this moment to stop and reflect on an important event which happened in Richmond, Virginia, January 16th, 1786, that Virginia Statue for Religious Freedom. And I think it's a simple corner with a simple monument, but with such a powerful idea that still resonates across our community and the world today. Look at our recent history. Certainly, we cannot have any discussion without the shadow, the influence of faith and religion in our decisions. Think about it. Religion in our schools continues to be discussed. Government funding, separation of church and state, marriage, abortion, all of these issues come back to this core: what do we think about ourselves? What do we believe about ourselves and the beliefs of others? We see that in the attacks on synagogues and other places of worship, that this basic freedom established with the Statute for Religious Freedom is still an important one that is being fought today in terms of its meaning and implications. And so today, it is an absolute privilege to have Dr. Alan Taylor with us to talk about some of that foundational work, the role of religion in colonial America, an important topic that sets the stage for everything that happens after. Dr. Taylor is a scholar of American history and the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation Professor of History at the University of Virginia's Corcoran Department of History. Dr. Taylor's written extensively about the colonial history of the United States, the American Revolution, and the early American Republic. He's published 7 books, is the recipient of 2 Pulitzer Prizes in history, the Bancroft Prize, and was also a finalist for the National Book Award. Dr. Taylor's most recent book, and it is an important book for all of us to read, it's really my first connection to Dr. Taylor's work, is American Republics, A Continental History of the United States, 1783 to 1850. Really looking at that early period in the formation of belief and religious expression in our country. So, Dr. Taylor, welcome. Alan, sorry.
That's okay.
Welcome to our day of reflection on what does this day mean? What does this month mean? And what does religious freedom mean?
Thank you very much. And I appreciate that very kind introduction. I appreciate being invited on this important occasion of reflection. I'm grateful to Liz for helping to arrange this and to our mutual friend Ed Ayers for making the introduction. And I'm grateful to all of you who are attending. What I'd like to do is to just try to explain why the Statute for Religious Freedom was part of such a truly revolutionary transformation in how people thought about their society and their relationship with their government. I want to spend a little bit of time explaining what preceded it. We can sometimes just think of that as the bad old days, and certainly from our perspective, one in which we take so seriously individual rights as foundational for our way of life. It can be hard to imagine a society that didn't think the same way about individual rights. Now, colonial Virginia, the leaders of colonial Virginia were very proud of their Englishness. They were not, during the 1740s or 50s or even 1760s, aspiring for independence. What they saw themselves as was English people who happened to live in America. And what they wanted was the respect of the people who lived in Britain. They wanted to be respected as their equals. Now, again, when I talk about the leaders of Virginia, I'm talking about the people who served in government, who led their counties, who owned large plantations, and owned enslaved people. So it is by no means a society of equal rights. Instead, the logic of Virginia society is the same logic that was held by the leading people in England in the middle of the 18th century. And that's that society was literally a corporate body. And they made the analogy to the human body, where the human body has many different but unequal parts that are all dependent on one another. So the head must govern, but the head cannot survive without the work of the hands and the feet. And yet the head has responsibilities to protect the hands and the feet. So the notion is that everybody in society is connected to everyone else, and that the most important thing is not the rights of the individual, although there was a conception that there were some rights, but that the corporate good was superior. There's also the notion that this is a hierarchy. As I mentioned, there are some parts that are superior to others, and they are arranged in a gradation, with the monarch, the king, at the top of society, aristocrats beneath him. There was neither king nor aristocrats literally in Virginia, but they were symbolically represented there. The top of society in Virginia was a grouping known as the gentry. They are the wealthiest people, and they tend to serve and lead the government. Beneath them, you would have somewhat small middle class of merchants and shopkeepers and master artisans and some of the most prosperous farmers, and then a much larger group of smallholders, people who would own their farm or rent a farm. All of these are free people. All of these could vote if they were male. And then about 40% of the population is held in slavery and have no rights at all, and are considered just subject to the authority of the free people. Now, the image I'm showing you here is the famous Bodleian Plate, a representation of the leading public buildings in Williamsburg. And we tend to just look at it in order to get information about individual buildings. But I want to call your attention to how the whole thing works as a whole, as a corporate whole. At the top is the College of William and Mary. And it's striking that it gets pride of place in this representation. But in many ways, the College of William and Mary in the colonial period is the glue that holds it all together. It's supposed to be the place where the next generation of the elite leading the colony will be educated. And a fair number of them are expected that they will travel across the Atlantic to be ordained as Anglican ministers, and then come back and administer a parish in Virginia. Now, in the middle tier, you see three buildings. On the left is the courthouse. In the center is the Legislative Assembly, and for the House of Burgesses, which is the name of the legislature. And then on the right is the governor's palace. And then, so these are the three branches of the government: the judiciary, the legislative, and the executive. The royal governor is appointed by the crown and serves at the sufferance of the crown. It's not elected by the people. And then the bottom tier are several representations of nature: spider, plants, and then native peoples cast as if they're just parts of nature. And so the whole thing works together to suggest that all of these forms of authority rest upon the nature of nature, that nature is also a hierarchy. And so that the human hierarchy and the human corporateness represents the corporateness and hierarchy of nature, that this is the natural order of things. And so people had believed for centuries, and so most people believed in Virginia in the colonial era. Now, this starts to come apart during the 1750s and early 1760s in tensions between the Anglican ministers and the gentry of Virginia. The part of the logic of a corporate hierarchical society is that there should be one church. Everybody should go to one single church. It will unify them. And they have some historical reasons for believing this, in that when England had been a more pluralistic society briefly in the middle of the 17th century, it was associated with a very bloody civil war, and then with a repressive regime, and then ultimately with the restoration of monarchy, which was regarded as a restoration of sanity by most people in England. And with the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, you had a restoration of the Church of England as the established church of the entire empire. And Virginia's leaders were very proud that they maintained a church establishment in which the Church of England, or the Anglicans, were the one favored church. Now, what form did this take? Well, it took that there is every parish, and usually a county would have one or sometimes two parishes. Every parish has a vestry, and the vestry governs the parish. The vestry consists of the wealthiest people, the most prestigious people in that particular parish. And they levy a tax on every taxpayer in the parish. And that tax goes to support a minister and to support the church. And the support for the minister includes a salary. It also includes possession of a farm known as a glebe to help support that minister. And the notion is that the minister should be able to live in a comfortable style that enables him to be a gentleman, to be the social peer of the gentry. So everybody's supposed to pay this tax, and everybody's supposed to go to the church on Sunday. And if somebody doesn't attend for a run of Sundays, that person could be fined. Now, the logic behind all of this is that church and state support each other, that without the community assembling in the church to see the social inequality represented there, with the gentry in the prime seats and the enslaved people, if they attended all, kept back in a gallery, it's to see the social order. And then it's to hear Christian morality preached in order to maintain the social and moral bonds of the community. And that without this, you would have the kind of anarchy that they associated with the English Civil War of the early 17th century. So there's very high stakes in maintaining this social cohesion. And there is a very pessimistic understanding of human nature outside of society, that unless they're in these social bonds with one another, maintained by a hierarchy and preached every Sunday from the pulpit that people will spin out of control and you'll have violent anarchy and civil war. So maintaining that kind of social order is continuous work. Now, as I said, this social logic, there are dissenters to it. They're growing in number in the middle of the 18th century. Some of them are well-educated men who are drawn to a new body of ideas that emphasizes individuality and rationality and challenges the traditional arrangement of society. We call that body of thought the Enlightenment. And people such as Thomas Jefferson are proponents of that. And the language of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom is very much the language of the Enlightenment, of the rights of the individual, of the goodness, fundamentally, of individuals and their capacity to make their own decisions. But that's a subversive cultural movement in the middle of the 18th century. It's also being challenged by a quite different group of evangelical Christians who also insist on their individual rights to absent themselves from the established church, to assemble in their own distinct churches, and to be freed from taxation. Now, they were subject to persecution in the middle of the 18th century and to being jailed and in some cases to being whipped. So there are these two challenges that emerge in the colonial period. And the gentry is becoming dissatisfied often with their relationship with the ministers, and the ministers, or parsons as they were called, are becoming dissatisfied with many of the gentry as being too controlling over them. And a prime moment is something called the Parsons' Cause, where they had pressed an appeal to the Privy Council in Britain, challenging how the colony of Virginia, how its legislature had undermined the value of their salary, with a particular conversion of their salary from pounds of tobacco to just a fixed rate in money at a time when the price of tobacco was quite high and those ministers stood to make a good income. So their income is torn down. The Privy Council rules in favor of the parsons. And then some of the parsons start to bring suits for their back pay. And in one of the most famous cases in Hanover County, Patrick Henry, who is represented here waving his hand, he is arguing the case, and here in a courtroom, that the ministers, in fact, do not deserve their back pay. Now, the particular minister who brought this case was a man named James Mowry, who is from Albemarle County and who had been Thomas Jefferson's primary teacher before Jefferson went away to college. And Jefferson had a fondness for Mowry throughout his life as a teacher, but Jefferson never wanted there to be this system of enforced financial support for one church. Now, Patrick Henry makes his mark in arguing this case in the early 1760s, and he will go on to a long and famous political career as a revolutionary leader and later as a governor of Virginia, and he will return in this story. Now, Thomas Jefferson is the intellectual heavyweight in the revolutionary transformation of the social and cultural logic that most leading people in Virginia subscribe to. A shift away from the corporate and hierarchical logic of tradition toward the notion of individual rights, of individual choice as being the best foundation for society. Now, he was confident that society could make this shift without reaping anarchy, because he believed that human beings, in fact, had a natural sociability, that if they were freed from the burden of traditions and traditional institutions' coercive power, that individuals would voluntarily associate in whatever groups made sense for them and would voluntarily support a Republican order, small r Republican, premised on individual rights. Now, Jefferson's statute gets deserved attention, but it also tends to steal attention away from the longer run of decisions that were critical to the disestablishment of the church in Virginia. So it doesn't just come out of the blue. The process actually begins in 1776, and Jefferson is at that time away doing some important business in the Continental Congress. And the writing of the Constitution of Virginia, to his dismay, is left to other men. But it turns out those other men are actually thinking along similar lines to Jefferson's. And in the Bill of Rights that Virginia adopts in 1776, they abolish this compulsory taxation to support one established church. They also say, however, that they will protect for all time the property of the Church of England in Virginia, meaning the churches and the glebes. The Bill of Rights is a very important, this is the State Bill of Rights of 1776, very important and very similar to other bills of rights in making this shift throughout the then 13 colonies, about to become 13 states. And this shift toward the notion that individuals have rights that pre-exist society, that pre-exist government, and they are therefore so foundational that government can't take those rights away. This is very different from the logic by which the British Parliament had issued legislation of toleration, which in effect said, we grant this from on high, which also suggests they could take it away on high. Once you establish that rights are foundational and pre-exist society and government, then government cannot take them away. And that's what Jefferson's expressing, and that's what other Virginia leaders are expressing in their State Bill of Rights of 1776, that comes well before the Federal Bill of Rights that is much more famous to us now. Now, this is an example of one of the many substantial brick churches erected around Virginia in most parishes. This is Bruton Parish Church in Williamsburg. And this is a representation of just how visually powerful the Church of England was in the landscape of colonial America. These are the most substantial buildings in almost every county, the best built, and certainly the tallest. They are meant to catch your eye. Now, during the Revolution, most of the Anglican ministry in Virginia did support the Revolution. There were some conspicuous exceptions. The Church of England has a tradition, its traditional service, a prayer on behalf of the king. The leaders of revolutionary Virginia said, you've got to stop praying for the king. You've got to instead pray for the Continental Congress and for the state of Virginia. Most of the Anglican ministers went along with that. A few of them refused, and they were harassed and driven out and became loyalists. But the norm is for the Anglican ministry to support the revolution, including this man whose name is James Madison, but is not the famous James Madison, but is a relative of his. During the Revolution, the leaders are overwhelmingly people who consider themselves Anglicans, including Jefferson, but who are insistent that they should control the church or subordinate the church to the larger political enterprise of the Revolution. And so they've taken away the tax support. And this is a bid for popular support because lots of people were tired of paying this tax. whether they were evangelicals or Anglicans or nothingarians, as they were called. And there are a fair number of people in Virginia that just didn't want to go to church. So it's a bid for popularity at a time of a revolutionary challenge, and they're trying to defeat Great Britain. And they need all the popular support they can. They need to enlist soldiers, and soldiers are coming from the lower ranks of society. Many of those people in the lower ranks are evangelicals. So the promise is being made to evangelicals, look, we're going to lift this burden from you, and we need your support for this revolution. And evangelicals give it and become great enthusiasts, by and large, for the revolutionary cause, and insist that they are better patriots than were the Anglicans. Now, after the revolutions won militarily, and this was a hard-fought struggle. Virginia's invaded. Much of Virginia is devastated by raiding British and Loyalist troops. The economy is disrupted because Virginia's economy at that time depended very heavily on the export of tobacco, and it's very difficult to export it much of the time during the Revolution because of British naval might. And then following that comes a prolonged depression, economic depression, in which the price of tobacco plunges, and it's real hard times. Now, at this time, in the early 1780s, the Anglican ministry is trying to make a comeback. And their income had been stripped away, and what's replaced it were subscriptions. And these subscriptions were that leading men in a particular parish would agree that they would pay so many pounds of tobacco to their minister to substitute for the salary. On paper, it looked nice, but most people on these subscription lists didn't pay. Now, one of the subscription lists supported Reverend Charles Clay of Albemarle County, who was a supporter of the Revolution, friend of Jefferson's, and Jefferson arranges this subscription. And Jefferson paid his share every year, but most of the other people on the subscription list just find one excuse or another not to pay. So Clay becomes very upset and sues the vestry, which is suing the people who are the subscribers. And that made them really unhappy. So even more people drop out of paying the subscription to Clay. So Clay drops out of the ministry, moves away to Bedford County, and becomes a politician, which turns out to be a better paying proposition in the new Republican order than being an Anglican minister. When he died, his will stipulated that a great stone cairn should be erected over his grave. It's 20 feet wide by 12 feet high. And there's nothing else like this over a minister's grave anywhere in Virginia. It's almost as if he felt that his income had been stolen from him, and now he fears somebody will steal his body. This particular cairn of stone still survives. It's currently within a golf course in Bedford County. Now, during the Revolution, the ministry, the established ministry has lost its income. Many ministers decide they'll just retire and go and do something else or move away out into another state or back to England in some cases. And so a lot of parishes are vacant. And this then becomes an opportunity for the other churches of Virginia to expand their ministries. And the leading churches were Methodists, Baptists, who offer a much cheaper ministry. Their ministers were not college educated at that time. They tended to be local common men, farmers, blacksmiths, who happened to read the Bible and to be inspired by it and to believe that they have had the new birth experience, have been literally touched emotionally by God. And that this is a truer calling to the ministry than an education is. So you've got a real cultural divide between people who are insisting that on prestige, on education, on genteel manners as qualifying the ministry. That's the older Anglican corporate hierarchical model. And then the newer model of the evangelicals, which is that God chooses his own ministry and does so regardless of whether somebody is prestigious or well-educated. And indeed, the argument the evangelicals made was that God prefers people who aren't well-educated and prestigious for his ministers. And then you have the Presbyterians, who are a bit in between. They're college educated, but they feel at odds with the Anglicans, who they regard as having benefited for a very long time from the support of the government. And the Presbyterians are then in this middle position in this religious political spectrum. Let me just go back and just speak a little bit longer. The Anglicans try to make a comeback. They rebrand themselves in 1784 as the Episcopal Church of Virginia. They renounce the tie to Britain, so you no longer have to go to Britain to be ordained, and they are not subject to the authority of the Archbishop of Canterbury or of the king anymore. They also seek and obtain from the state legislature incorporation, legal incorporation that enables them to collectively own their glebes and churches, and it provides a further level of protection for that property. They are the only church in Virginia that has this right of legal incorporation. Incorporation at that time was very rare, and it was considered legally very powerful protection. So when this passes, it passes the legislature because many members of the legislature are actually concerned that society is becoming immoral, that too many people are spending their time drinking and fighting, and not enough people are going to church, that the moral order is decaying. So they think, well, the revolution's over, the war is won, let's retrench a bit and let's re-bolster the Anglican Church with this incorporation. So the legislature passes it, and passes it over the protests of Jefferson's good friend, James Madison of Orange County. Now, Madison had been educated at Princeton, which was largely a Presbyterian institution. He is somebody who, like his dear friend Jefferson, is a believer in Enlightenment principles of individual rights. And he is very uncomfortable with this partial retreat represented by the Act of Incorporation. But he decides this is something that he can't defeat, and he's going to try to defeat the next measure being pushed by the Episcopalians, which is something called the General Assessment. What they introduce is a tax, again, that everybody in Virginia will have to pay. The beneficiaries of this tax could be, but need not be, the local Episcopal minister, but would be whatever minister in the community that the taxpayer designated. And if the taxpayer declined to designate a church, then the money would go toward education. But the logic behind this is that everybody ought to contribute, that the preaching of Christianity was a public good, and that it maintained moral order, and that moral order was essential to sustaining the new Republican order of the state of Virginia. So this is moving the logic of Virginia republicanism back in the more traditional conservative direction of thinking that church and state have to be intertwined for the mutual benefit of both of them. That the church needs, or Christianity needs, the support of the government, and the government cannot preserve itself without a moral order preached by Christianity. So, this is very troubling to Jefferson, who is away as in France as the American ambassador to France. And it's troubling to his good friend, James Madison, who is a master legislator, but who loses out on the incorporation issue, but plays a very successful delaying game in blocking the general assessment by persuading other legislators that maybe they should just hold this over to the next session so that they could go home and talk to their constituents. Well, when they go back to their constituents, they tend to get an earful from people who don't want to pay any new tax. And petitions flow in. And some of these are just from people who don't want any higher tax in a time of economic depression. And others are coming from evangelicals and Presbyterians saying, we don't want this because we really see this as a Trojan horse that is reintroducing the church establishment. Now, some Presbyterian ministers had been briefly tempted by this because their taxpayers could designate their tax going to them, and these Presbyterian ministers were feeling that they were being stinted in their income under the voluntary system. But their laity, their common people in their church, said, no way. So this is a key moment. This comes before the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom and is really the key struggle. And James Madison is the key leader, working together with evangelicals, although he himself is not an evangelical, in order to prevent this general assessment. Now, one of the men who was pushing for the general assessment is a good friend of Thomas Jefferson and a classmate, John Page, who had been briefly governor of Virginia. And John Page writes to Jefferson and says, in effect, to him, look, you really ought to support this because you're not really recognizing what's happened, is that education's being devalued in Virginia. Rationality is being devalued. These evangelicals are emotional, they're irrational, they challenge authority. We need something like this to stabilize society, writes this to Jefferson. Jefferson writes back very politely and just kind of ignores the key arguments in Page's letter. Meanwhile, at the same time, Jefferson's writing to Madison to cheerlead blocking the general assessment. And one of the guys who's really pushing for the general assessment is a surprising character. It's Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry is a devout Christian. He liked the Anglican Church. He had been a lawyer in the famous Parsons cause. And so he wants to put limits on the Parsons in that context. But in the post-revolutionary context, he says society does need to be restabilized, and any organized church deserves to have financial support from taxpayers in order to contribute to that post-revolutionary stabilization. And Henry's a formidable politician. And so while there's a lot of popular energy against the general assessment, to have Patrick Henry, the most eloquent man in Virginia, and quite a powerful man, saying, no, we really need to do this, really worries Jefferson and Madison. And what Jefferson says, what we must devoutly do is pray for Patrick Henry's death. He's being sardonic, but Jefferson never really liked Patrick Henry. I mean, Patrick Henry never really liked Jefferson. Madison has a different idea. Let's just get Patrick Henry out of the legislature. And the way to do that is to elect him as the governor. And the governor of Virginia, under the original Constitution of Virginia, is a pretty weak office. And so they shunt Patrick Henry off to the governorship. He's flattered by this, loves being governor, but he then loses most of his influence in the legislature. And the legislature will defeat the general assessment. And that's really the key legislative struggle. And after that, then, the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom is the culmination of this long process. Or it is the symbolic statement that there's no going back. So key steps are the Bill of Rights of 1776, the suspension of religious taxation that is rendered perpetual in 1779, but just by a statute, then the partial setback of incorporation of the Episcopal Church in 84, then the defeat of general assessment in 1785, and then in 1786, the Statute of Religious Freedom is adopted overwhelmingly by the legislature. And then a year later, in 1787, the incorporation of the Episcopal Church was revoked. There'll be one further struggle, which will be the confiscation of the glebes from the Episcopal Church, and that will stretch on into the early 19th century. Now, a man who played a pretty important role, and a very telling role, as a supporter for this push for the Virginia Statute and for the revocation of the incorporation, and then ultimately of the confiscation of the glebes, is Wilson Carey Nicholas of Albemarle County. He's a friend of Jefferson's, powerful politician. He is the son of a very conservative man who had been a great champion of the church order in Virginia in the previous generation, Robert Carter Nicholas. And so Wilson Carey Nicholas is very different from his father, quite under Jefferson's influence. And he will cast some key votes in these legislative decisions of the mid-1780s, much to the dismay of his mother, who said to him that he was, quote, pulling down the church. And so there were older people, particularly of the wealthier, more prestigious families, that felt that the younger generation of Thomas Jefferson and Wilson Carey Nicholas are betraying traditions that were foundational to the social order. But Wilson Carey Nicholas's mother is speaking for a fading generation, and the social order, the political order of Virginia, has been transformed through this uneasy alliance between some rather secular-minded political leaders like Madison and Jefferson and Nicholas, with evangelicals who very devoutly believed in a form of Christianity that is quite at odds with the beliefs of these leading men. But they find common cause in tearing down the edifice of the old social order for their quite different purposes and different visions of the future of Virginia as a republic. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions or hear any thoughts you have.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. That was wonderful. I wanted to start with a question that was submitted that asked if you could tell us a little bit about how religious diversity in Virginia might have changed in the years following adoption of this statute, and what you know about sort of the religious groups that were coming to Virginia following adoption.
Yeah. Well, at the time of the Revolution, 1776, evangelicals are probably have as many people attending their churches as going to the Anglican Church. This is not equally distributed across Virginia. In the Tidewater, most people still go to an Anglican church. In the Piedmont, you'd find many more of these evangelicals and Presbyterians. And then in westernmost Virginia, which at that time was everything west of the Blue Ridge, you'd find churches were kind of few and far between, and what you would find would usually be evangelical with an occasional Presbyterian church. After this revolutionary transformation of the social order in Virginia for free people, because it doesn't affect slavery in any major way, I would say, and put a little asterisk, there is a right to manumit slaves, which didn't exist before, and it creates a somewhat larger free Black population. But with that small exception, the changes in society in Virginia are for free people. And what happens is that the Anglican/Episcopal Church is so undermined because it was so dependent on financial support. Somebody's not going to go away and spend years of college studying theology of the Anglican sort unless they have some confidence that they're going to have a career on the other side of it. So the Anglican ministry just withers Episcopal minister. And that creates a vacuum. And into that vacuum, you have many more evangelical and Presbyterian churches popping up in places like Richmond and even in the Tidewater, just because a lot of people want to go to church and they want to hear sermons and they want their morality bolstered and they want the sense of community. So when the Anglican Church can't provide that anymore, then they're looking for alternatives. And the three great churches of Virginia in terms of numbers, number one is Baptist, number two is Methodist, number three is Presbyterians, and this is in terms of numbers. And then a distant fourth have become the Episcopalians.
Thank you. We had another question submitted, and I'm not sure if you'll have the answer to this because it might be too specific, but someone asked if St. John's Church in Richmond was legally incorporated during the late 1700s.
Well, it's part of the whole Episcopal Church. Collectively, the Episcopal Church of Virginia collectively owns the Anglican churches throughout Virginia under the Act of Incorporation of 1784, including St. John's Church.
This is for you specifically. Do you have any upcoming events where people might be able to see you in person and have books signed?
That's an excellent question. I'm doing something, I believe it's still going to be in person at Westminster Country Club, I think it is, which is near Charlottesville. So that would be an occasion. And that is coming up, I believe, February 3rd. But I would check with them. I don't have my schedule book right in front of me. It's on a Thursday. I'm pretty sure it's February 3rd. It's in the evening. So that's the one thing I know of that will be in a public presentation.
Thank you.
If people want to send me book plates, I'm always happy to sign those and send them back to you.
Oh, lovely. Yeah, I know that the in-person signings are a little bit few and far between these days, but hopefully we will get back there.
Yeah.
We had another question that asked if you might be able to speak about the introduction of the Catholic faith in Virginia.
Well, there have been Catholics in Virginia ever since the early 17th century, but they were few and far between. They were persecuted. In the 17th century, religious wars are very much a thing throughout Europe, and England had made a commitment to the Protestant faith in the form of Anglicanism, and Catholicism was considered by most people in England as the faith of traitors, associated with Spain and then later with France, who were the enemies of England. So to be a colonial Catholic, to be an English Catholic was a tough thing to do, particularly in the 16th century. It gets a little better toward the end of the 17th century, but still you're considered not entirely with the program. And that's also the case in the colonies, with the partial exception of Maryland, which the King Charles I was kind of a secret Catholic, married to a Catholic, tolerated Catholics, and he wanted them to have a haven. So Maryland gets set up. So if you were going to be a Catholic in the colonies, your best place was Maryland rather than Virginia. Now that protection for Catholicism dissolves in Maryland for very complicated reasons at the end of the 17th century. But still, there are more substantial numbers of Catholics in Maryland than elsewhere in the colonies, and they're largely able to go about their faith without interference in Maryland. Elsewhere, Catholicism was pretty uncommon in colonial America. Okay, I can't hear you anymore.
There we go. Sorry about that. A similar question we received is asking about Quaker groups. And someone says, I recently learned that some of my ancestors were Quakers in Virginia, and I'm curious about that faith in Virginia and where, if you know where in Virginia some of the Quaker communities were.
Quakers were surprisingly numerous present. Now, surprisingly numerous, which was still talking something on the order of maybe 5% or so in colonial Virginia. They tended to be concentrated on the Eastern Shore or in the Western Shore Tidewater counties. And they're tolerated, but they're expected to pay this tax that was levied on everybody. Quakers start to get in trouble with other Virginians because the Quakers are the first church to renounce slavery and to say you can't be a good Quaker if you own slaves. So there were Quakers who did own slaves in Virginia, and most of them free their slaves, and they're doing so 1760s, early 70s, or you stop being a Quaker. And a fair number of people said, I'm not a Quaker anymore if I can't keep this form of property. And so other Virginians aren't really comfortable with the growth of the free Black population that happens, especially in the 1780s and 90s. And Quakers have organized some anti-slavery societies. They've organized societies that try to provide schooling for freed Blacks. And this makes them pretty unpopular with a lot of their neighbors. And so some legislation is introduced basically saying that Quakers could not serve as advocates for Black people in Virginia, that they couldn't bring lawsuits on their behalf, they couldn't testify for them. So Quakers tend to move out of Virginia. They're kind of victims of the new Republican order, which is saying that we don't want Quakers messing around with the property rights of the majority of free people in Virginia.
Very interesting. Thank you. I think that is for the last question that we've had submitted.
Okay.
I'll kind of put a final call if anyone has additional questions. In the meantime, I want to thank you so much for being with us this morning. It was fascinating. And I will also just mention, I promised our manager at the Valentine shop that I would mention to folks out there that we have a number of Dr. Taylor's books on sale in the shop at the Valentine. So if you're interested in learning more, we suggest that you come and check them out. And I think that brings us to the conclusion of our morning. Thank you, Dr. Taylor, so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I hope that folks will visit us at the Valentine and at the Valentine First Freedom Center to learn more. Have a great morning.
Thank you.